actually fell apart because of corruption. So someone was done for it. The president was done for it. And with that, everyone was out. They just all left panicking that they were going to be prosecuted too. So the federation actually had a whole upheaval. And it is much better now. It's much better run. It has its problems, but it's like a definitely a better organisation. So we actually brought our team and joined the other league, the official league, and then that was the only league. And we had to start from the very bottom, which was effectively the third division, which is a cup competition, effectively, the amateur national cup, which we won, and then we went up to the second division, and then in the second division we ended up getting into the playoffs. In the playoff final, so all games in Mongolia are played basically in one stadium, the national stadium. Very few teams have their own stadiums. Maybe a couple others do. Like Erchim, the old champions did, and a couple of teams that aren't in Ulaanbaatar have their own stadiums. But basically everything was played in the same stadium for this tournament. And then there was a home leg and an away leg. So at the end of this second leg, it finished and we were level on aggregate. And everyone sort of just stood there. And then both teams started celebrating. And there was this moment where we all thought that we'd scored more away goals because we didn't know which leg was which. So no team knew. And in the end, it turned out we'd lost. And we thought this was terrible at the time, but because we'd missed out on promotion to the Mongolian Premier League. But actually, what then happened was the team, not the team that had beaten us, but the team that had been promoted automatically, refused their place in the Premier League. And we were told, you have to take it or you actually get relegated.
Wow.
Which I still don't totally know how they came up with that rule, but I think they were just worried no one was going to take this place. And so we did take it. And what we didn't realise was that was basically the key to our unravelling. And the reason why people don't want to be in the Mongolian Premier League is because you're suddenly in a league where some of the teams have huge amounts of money. I mean, by Mongolian standards, have huge amounts of money. And they're bringing in all these foreigners who are obviously really talented, and our whole model was homegrown young talent, and we were going to get absolutely destroyed week in, week out. And we kind of had bargained on having another season in that second division to build.
Okay. Yeah.
And we were suddenly thrust into this absolute chaos.
So how do you make that step up, knowing that you're going to be kind of outweighed financially? And did you find enough like young talent there to be optimistic and be like, with a few years, this could be a kind of a big project? Or
it was tough. So a lot of things happened. First of all, we brought in a British coach, a guy called Shadab Iftikhar, brilliant coach from Preston. We phoned him. Well, he says he was in Asda 1 minute, and he was in Ulaanbaatar the next. So the problem was we had 2 young Mongolian coaches, and that was our plan, to bring them up. The rule is once you're in the top division in Mongolia, they have to have a certain license. I think it was probably equivalent of an A license, and they didn't have it, these young coaches. So we suddenly were told you have to have a coach with this license or you can't start the season. So we had to recruit a foreign coach because nobody in Mongolia had that license at the time who wasn't already attached to a club. So we looked abroad and found this guy Shadab, who's amazing. He had been an assistant to Roberto Martinez, and still is, in fact, in Belgium. He's one of his on his technical team, but like amazing coach who'd really struggled to get opportunities basically because of racism in the UK. He's got, he's British, Pakistani. He has a beard and he is a Muslim, and those things sadly are still prohibitive to getting a job in football, which is terrible, but that is a reality. A guy with his qualifications would be coaching easily at a good level in the UK if he wasn't called Shadab Iftikhar. If he was called Michael Smith, he'd be in League Two by now. So we had this opportunity to give him a job, and we were getting something that we no way should have had a coach this good. And he was delighted by the opportunity. So we were like, he came and he said that the negotiation was the funniest one ever because we quoted a terrible wage because that was all we had. And he said, okay, can you do more? And we said, no. He said, all right. And that was it. He came over. So we had this coach, and he was a brilliant coach, but we had no way of competing at that level. Absolutely none. And we may have had a better chance, but we got slightly pulled apart by the fact our budget got decimated because we ended up signing 2 Nigerian players who we signed because they'd been victims of effectively trafficking. and we signed them to look after them, make sure they got home, they couldn't play for us. We knew that. So that basically blew our budget up. But I still stand by it. But it was a thing we had to do. It's very prevalent in Mongolia. We learned from these two Nigerian kids, that they've been signed by quite big clubs who say that we'll look after your visa, and then the clubs don't get their visa sorted properly, so they're only legally in the country for 2 months. Then they tell them after 2 or 3 months, you're now an illegal immigrant, and we're going to pay you less because we're going to look after you, make sure you don't get arrested. And then the club keeps taking the money down, but the players still keep playing because they have no other option. And these players had refused and just said, no, we won't do this anymore. So they were effectively homeless. The club reported them to the FA as illegal immigrants, so they couldn't play for any other club. And we found them on a park bench in the centre of Ulaanbaatar, and put them in a house and had them in our training sessions, but we knew they could never play for us. And then we eventually spent basically the last of our transfer budget on paying a bribe to get them out of the country, so they could get home.
Wow, and that is such a, when you say you stand by that decision, yes, you should stand by that decision 100%. But so this human so when you talked about the corruption within the league, I assume a big part of it was this kind of, in quotes, human trafficking was a big part of the corruption that was involved as well. And it's I assume it's not only within Mongolia, but more that area of the world in general, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of it around. I can't really speak for how common it is, and I think things probably are being done to try and stop it. This is a few years back now, but it's a really common practice, and it's really awful. It's just dreadful. I think it's done in different ways, and I think the way they operated with these guys was very clever, because it basically created a scenario where their only option was to turn themselves into the authorities, which is a terrifying thing to do in a country you don't know, where I think they could have gone to prison according to the law there, and no one's likely to do that, or try and contact their families back home who are very poor, from a very poor part of Lagos, try and get them to summon the money to pay their fine and get them back out, which in itself would have been a massive task, but also the shame that would have brought upon them, given that their whole thing when they left was, I'm going to make something of myself, That was why they left Nigeria, to make their families proud, to sort of make their money. So yeah, it's very insidious, and you hear about things like, you hear about other methodologies, like where a person will say, "I've got your flight tickets," and actually accompany a player to somewhere where they have a contract, then remove their passport, take their wages, and effectively have them. It's effectively slave labour. So you hear about very different methodologies, but it's rife in football. And Central Asia is very bad. I think Laos and Cambodia, again, you get these situations develop very easily.
And right now you told us you're actually working at a project to prevent player trafficking from happening. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about this? Yes,
I set up something, just set up something with a friend of mine, Dominic Stevenson, and we set up a project based along these lines. It's sort of similar. So we're setting up something called Society for Protection of Footballers International, and the idea is we're going to give out fact sheets and to be distributed to players in countries that are susceptible to player trafficking, to player abuse, to be given to young kids who may be the victims, that just give them a few pieces of advice, in the local language, wherever that is. It'll be translated into, whether it's French or Arabic or English or whatever, to just hopefully equip players with a knowledge of what can happen. Because, there's many, many, many routes in why trafficking happens and why it works. And there's many, many, many problems there. But if you can equip players with just a little bit more knowledge, it might at least help one or two of them not go down that road, which, it can destroy lives. And it's such a big problem, and nothing's really being done about it as far as I can see.
And we still have, by the way, this is awesome that you're doing this. Honestly, before we started this Zoom call, I had never thought about player trafficking, like human trafficking in football was something that I had never really stopped to think about. Something I've always ignored. I don't know. I've read nothing actually about it. So very interesting. There is actually another very interesting thing that we want to talk about in your past. But since we're at the present, you just told us about your very interesting project to prevent human player trafficking. What is this other project that you have called Kitmas, correct?
Yeah, so Kitmas was we just stumbled upon it really. So I send a lot of kit around to different places, to projects that need football shirts or football boots. I send it around all over the world really. Towards the end of last year, I had about 15 really nice, pristine, brand new football shirts, but nowhere with them for them to go. And so I came up with the idea that because of the situation we were in economically, a lot of families were struggling. It was getting towards Christmas, and said, what if we found families who may not be able to afford to buy presents for their children and gave these shirts away? And then I thought, well, what if we could get to 100 shirts? And so started putting the kind of call out, and it just went crazy. The amount of support we had, we ended up getting 950 football shirts that distributed around 14 different centres, community centres effectively that work with families in the UK. And so, we ended up giving just a load of shirts away that could be given to children for Christmas. And it was really nice. It's amazing how this community can rally around. I think you really see the best of people through football, as well as, people always talk about the bad. And I've spoken about the bad with trafficking, but there's also an awful lot of good that, normal people do through football, I think.
No, I think, and it's great that you've seen both sides of it. And as we're going to look at the positive, what is the biggest positive you take from your time in Mongolia? And what did you think about living in Central Asia? Because as I think I mentioned before we recorded that I lived in Kazakhstan myself. How did you find life in Central Asia? And what's the biggest positive you take from that?
The biggest positive for me were the kids that we worked with, the kids that we had as our players were fantastic players, but more than that, they were just fantastic people. They were so welcoming, kind, and humble, and they were lovely people. And it wasn't always easy because of the language barrier, and English isn't widely spoken. When I tried to learn Mongolian, it went so badly that one of the players said I sounded like a dog. So I did struggle with the language barrier. It was a battle, but I really did love working with those players. I didn't find Mongolia an easy place to live. I think partly it was obviously the temperature is difficult in winter. Partly it's the language barrier. And as I said, I really did try and learn Mongolian and struggled quite badly with it. And I think Ulaanbaatar is a very tough place. People have a vision of Mongolia as the steppe, this beautiful wilderness and nature. And actually the reality is Ulaanbaatar is hugely overpopulated. You're sitting in traffic for hours on end trying to get anywhere, and there's fumes and smog, and it's not an easy place for a foreigner to live, I think. So my experience of the region was not like totally negative, but I did find it a difficult place to live, I've got to say. And this is after 3 years, I guess, of being in and out of there.
Yeah, no, I kind of felt my experience in Almaty was similar to that. It was, the smog was ridiculous. The city was beautiful, but if you went down the wrong street, it got very not beautiful very quickly, if you know what I mean. But no, that's like Central Asia. Since living there, I've always a bit more obsessed about it now. I find it such an interesting part of the world because, as we said before, nobody really talks about it. Nobody really knows much about it. It's kind of sat between these two continents, so I think it's quite an interesting place to be. But difficult place to live, I think. Yeah,
definitely.
And Paul, in 2018, you were also the official organizer of the 2018 CONIFA World Cup, correct?
Yeah, I was, yes. World Football Cup. If we called it World Cup, we got sued. So World Football Cup.
World Football Cup, okay. We don't want to be sued either. So why don't you tell our listeners what this... I had actually heard about this competition because there is a team that takes part in it that is actually Italian, Padania.
Yeah. It's a tricky one, right?
It's a tricky one, right? So tell our listeners what it is about, and then we have a few questions just about the squads that actually participate, and then we will let you go, promised.
Sure. So it's the idea of CONIFA, Confederation of Independent Football Associations, it's to represent nation states and peoples that don't fit into FIFA's model. So like the best example of that probably is the easiest one is for people to understand is Tibet, probably. So if you're Tibetan, your options through the FIFA system don't exist. You have to play for China, which is clearly not going to work. So what actually happens is